Today's show will examine what's happened to Dr. Martin Luther King's dream for America. Have we lost the war for civil rights? Here to help me answer these questions is distinguished law professor and best-selling author Derek Bell.
The reality is no one is even asking the question, much less trying to answer it, what happened to Martin Luther King's dream. And that's probably a pretty sad but accurate way of summarizing where we've gone in the last 20 years.
Well, in your book, Confronting Authority, Reflections of an Ardent Protester, you suggest, and I think an interesting statement, that racism not only hurts, obviously, blacks, Latinos, and others on the receiving end, but it can also hurt the majority.
Oh, yeah, that's the easiest thing to say. I mean, if I could get that message across, you could carry me away. I would think that my mission as a teacher were complete. But it is very tough. It's been very tough throughout history. How would you have gone about getting the white indentured servants, formerly indentured, now the yeomen, during the middle 1600s when slavery was just getting underway? How could you convince them that they were being sold a bill of goods by the plantation owners who said, hey, we're going to reduce these blacks to lifetime indentured slavery, and you got to stand with us in case they try to escape or revolt. And we're going to let you vote. We're going to lower the poll taxes. Well, once they agreed to that, they were always going to be economically subordinated. They couldn't afford slaves. They were never going to be able to compete. And we have that same pattern down through history. We have it again today, where the reaction to the wholesale shipment of jobs out of the country, the wholesale importation of legal and illegal aliens, the downsizing, the automation, the response to all of that is, well, it must be affirmative action.
What do progressives, what do people who don't like this kind of America that's starting to build, which, as you say, won't only sweep down poor blacks and Latinos, but will hurt a lot of other people. What do people start to do to confront these issues?
I think that there is in any catastrophe, there is opportunity. In my book, I talk about what happens to the individual protester, the person that stands up when everybody else is sitting down, who speaks out when everyone else is silent. Well, basically, it's not good. Those in power retaliate.
Right.
Those who you would hope would align themselves with you back off and perhaps become hostile. Nevertheless, there are marvelous values in standing up. And rather than wait until new leaders come forth, until new organizations are formed, I think that the invitation out there now is that in whatever way we can, we as individuals need to reach out and do what we can to start moving things in the other direction. Well, you say, what can one person do? Well, it's amazing what one person can do once they're willing to do it. People say to me, well, Bell, you gave up your job at Harvard. Have they hired anybody up there? The answer is no. They said, well, then you lost. I said, no, I didn't lose. A whole generation of students, not only at Harvard, but at law schools across the country, know what I stood up for. And whether they're willing to do it right now or not, they know that that is an option that has been given to them not simply in lecture form or preachment form, but through example.
I guess when I look to my 14-year-old, I'm trying to present to him and my daughter, 9, what they should be preparing themselves for. In your view, as you're dealing with students every day, how should we start to get them tough enough and ready enough to confront these kinds of challenges? It's
very hard, but I think that the answer is in most religious teaching, that life is challenge, and that here is this array of challenges we didn't think you were going to have to face, but there they are. The message, and it's hard. I have 3 grown sons. The message is to reach out, try to make things better in your job, try to do it with as much integrity as well as much energy as possible. And the rewards are, some of the rewards are guaranteed. The reward of feeling better about yourself is guaranteed. The reward of bottom line success is less guaranteed, but it occurs often in ways that we would never expect.
Today, some 40 years after the birth of the civil rights movement, we're still struggling with race issues in America. Clearly, we still do not provide equal education and opportunity for all our children. Too often, these issues founder on the rocks of racism. This nation needs to strengthen and contribute and seek the contributions of all of its citizens to face a highly competitive world. To write off even the least of its people diminishes all of us. There was an opinion piece in the New York Post, I think, some days ago, which talked extensively about the problem of teenage mothers and how they are getting on welfare in order to, having more children rather, to get more money. What do you think about that kind of argument?
Well, in the first place, it is important to know that the number of young women
Right.
between the ages of 15 and 19 who are on welfare, who receive AFDC, that has decreased over the past 10 years, and we're talking about less than 3% of those who are on welfare. So, you know, we're picking on a very small percentage of the welfare population.
How could you come up with a work program that wouldn't further penalize people on welfare and actually give them some experience that's useful?
Well, let me just say one thing. People want work should pay.
Right.
That's what Mr. Clinton is saying. So that people who are working should earn more. So increasing the minimum wage should be part of this debate. I'm pleased to hear that that's being discussed now. But to have people who are working full-time, who are still below the poverty line, who must still apply for Medicaid because they have no coverage, is to set people up to fall off the edge.
Right.
And then when they fall into welfare, we demonize them.
And I think people are so frustrated with their own stagnation in wages and their own fears for their children that they really want to find what's wrong with this system that's holding us back. And I think the political leadership has taken advantage of them. And this is not a Democratic or Republican thing.
No.
They don't have the solutions for wage stagnation. That's clear. We don't know how we're going to remain competitive in a world economy where people with lower or semi-skills or not adequate or appropriate skills are going to get the kind of wage increases that we got used to during the 50s, 60s, and part of the 70s. So they've now been convinced if we can just squeeze the welfare cost, that somehow this will result in improved living standard for working people. I think we're going to go through a period of time where this experiment will go on and there'll be a lot of suffering. It's interesting, one of the reasons that the idea of taking immigrants off the rolls in New York State and City is not so attractive is because it's not so easy to get only at immigrants who are considered somewhat unacceptable. We're not talking about Haitians, we're not talking about Dominicans. This would have an incredibly bad impact on, for instance, people who are fleeing the former Soviet Union because they're one of the highest users of these kinds of transitional welfare services, and rightfully so. But I think people would like to paint this as an image of all those people they don't like. The trouble is these kinds of attacks will not discriminate, and I use that advisedly, between those immigrants of color who may not be quite as attractive to some people in America, as opposed to people who are in desperate affairs and are seeking asylum from really terrible condition. And I think we're going to have to keep hammering about that. I want to protect all immigrants who have a right to participate in this country and who have been allowed to come in here legally and without respect to color. What would we do, given our druthers, if we could really actually talk about reforming welfare? What would we take this whole issue aside of what the conservatives are planning? What would we do to really make it a system that's humane?
In the first instance, I think we have to look at who is on welfare. And that 66% get off in 3 years.
Right.
I would leave that 66% alone. And then focus on those who stay on for a longer period of time. Because that has always been the major problem and the major concern of the American public. Those who seem to stay on for a longer period of time. And that I would not leave the 66% alone. I'd increase the AFDC limit, because to give people help and then say, but we really want you to suffer while we are helping you, is not really help. It's helpful, but that's not the best way to help. With that other 33% that stays on for a longer period of time, we are to analyze that population. Many of them need job training. Many need education. We know that if we provide education to some of these young women, that not only will they be off welfare, but their children will be assured middle-class status.
Americans are not quite ready to buy into the dump the poor policy. Polls clearly show that Americans are uneasy with the GOP proposal to deny aid to unwed teenage mothers and their newborn children. And even with the promise of block grants to the states, not all governors are convinced they should assume the federal government's welfare burden. As 1995 gets underway, the challenge will be to find the right mix of governmental help and compassion to spare those already burdened by poverty from suffering even greater harm. No society that considers itself civilized can do otherwise. Today we'll be looking at health issues that touch all of our lives. The selling of New York City hospitals, the forcing of Medicaid recipients into managed healthcare organizations, and of course, balancing governmental budgets through Medicaid and Medicare cuts. To help us assess the impact of changes in healthcare delivery, I have as my guest John Ronchez, Executive Director of the Committee of Interns and Residents. I'm on the board of the Health and Hospitals Corporation, and there's a fight, obviously, that's being conducted on the issue of privatization of public hospitals.
We think that the government, the city government, has an obligation among its other obligations, like providing police and fire services, to provide basic health care services. There's a long history in this city, David, as you know, of voluntary hospitals failing to provide the level of services that the communities require. For example, back in the late 70s and early 80s, there was a very common problem that we referred to then as patient dumping, where the voluntary hospitals, that is the private or not-for-profit hospitals, would refuse to provide medical care to people, sometimes who were in dire need of medical care, because they lacked insurance or the ability to pay for their medical care. The law that I just told you about, which prohibits voluntary hospitals from refusing emergency care to people, has frequently been described by the mayor or people on his staff as requiring the voluntary hospitals, prohibiting them from turning away any patient. And that's just not so.
There's a sense in many communities that they are concerned about the idea of privatization. Are there alternatives that have been suggested to try to help the corporation deal with its financial distress? Does your union, for instance, come up with some alternative measures that could be taken that could avert this kind of transfer?
Well, David, you have to go back to the origins of the Health and Hospitals Corporation and look at the management structure. Right. One of the things that was clear to everyone at the time that the Health and Hospitals Corporation was created back in 1970 was that there should be a board of directors separate from the day-to-day hurly-burly of the city and separate from the city's budget structure, who would then be responsible for guiding the public hospitals system so that it would provide the services that city residents need and would do it economically and do it well. The mayor, through his appointments to the board and through ignoring the board of directors of the Health and Hospitals Corporation, has in effect relocated the center of operating the Health and Hospitals Corporation from its board of directors, who are the lawful authority, to a basement office in the city hall. We think that one thing that should be done immediately is that the mayor should recognize and acquiesce to the statutory authority that's vested in the members of the board of directors of the Health and Hospitals Corporation and let them do their job.
I think we are in serious independence issues. This is not acting like a fully independent body, certainly not in the way that the legislature, when it created the Health and Hospitals Corporation, had hoped it would act.
It's immoral to make healthcare decisions which affect millions of people in the city of New York simply based on how much it costs there isn't rational planning or recognition of community needs or the special needs of New Yorkers anywhere in the planning that's going on, if indeed there is any planning going on by the mayor's office. Every decision that we've seen come out of City Hall since the inception of this administration has been driven by money concerns and the interest of the mayor's office in saving money out of the healthcare system. And what we need is for the Health and Hospitals Corporation Board, again, who are the lawful authority, to take the responsibility for making these decisions and to say no.
There's something clearly wrong with the healthcare picture today. Instead of being driven by the need to provide competent service for the very sick, governments and institutions are being motivated to cut budgets without regard to the human cost. The United States, and indeed New York City, have medical care systems second to none. Let's not dismantle quality programs in haste and regret the results at our leisure. Parents and thoughtful citizens agree that the school system in New York City does not educate youngsters for the tasks of a technological society. The public schools are mired in 19th century educational practices when its students face a complex 21st century. Bearing the brunt of this problem are poor and minority students locked into their ill-equipped, poorly staffed neighborhood schools. But there are some winds of change abroad. The brightness of these kids when you talk to them one-on-one, and their clear wish to drive for a decent life and a good education is there. All the tools are there. But somehow the public sometimes gets convinced that this is all cultural and lack of initiative, when I think we didn't provide the right inputs when they were vitally necessary. In 1 year, in third grade, I think we had 5 or 6 substitute teachers. And by the end of it, when I was tested because my parents had the wherewithal and decided this wasn't working, I basically was reading on a second grade level. And I still remember the fights that they conducted to try to change that. What was terrifying when I visit and talk to people around schools like PS 138, not the ones that have been the focus of so much attention and specialty, that you find some of the same things. The overconcentration of substitute teachers, the lack of first-class environment, all the things that I thought would be gone in the 1950s, which were the bad old days of a still segregated city public system, seem to have not relieved themselves in many locales. And of course, setting higher standards in math and science without the ammunition of kids getting the very best instruction becomes a kind of catch-22 that could really be a monumental defeat for minority and poor children if we don't address it. I think people have started to take the stories of criminality and violence in the schools and the failure of many minority children to achieve and sort of held them up by their ears saying, look, these kids must be inherently unable to cope with it. And part of the fight I find is constantly re-educating people on this issue. And I think the disappointment I feel as an advocate that we just haven't heard a vigorous statement, not even the money, just someone who articulates the case for inner city education and its vital national interest is really one of my most grievous problems with the new administration, or not so new administration. But the Congress, too, has been virtually silenced. The landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision, which was supposed to end school segregation in America. Yet today, 40 years later, we find ourselves grappling with increasingly segregated school systems, this time in the North. How long can we keep denying all our citizens an equal opportunity in education? We can no longer keep failing at the most important task that society has, that of educating the next generation. We cope with the argument that we hear from conservatives all the time, that really money doesn't matter, that basically a one-room schoolhouse with an earthen floor can educate just as effectively as Stuyvesant High School.
Anybody who has any knowledge about education knows that if you go to a school where the books are 35 years old and the plaster's falling off the ceiling, you can't do as well as you go when a school is well taken care of and have adequate books, and that's a function of money. The other thing is a tremendous amount of research that indicates that money does make a difference. There have been literally hundreds of studies looking at various comparisons of school districts that are funded one way, school districts that are funded another way. In New York State, for example, it's so absolutely ridiculous to even talk about the fact that money doesn't make a difference. In the upstate, in the wealthier communities, in the Westchesters of the world, you have guidance counselors 4 or 5 times the number that you have in the city schools, with students who don't need that kind of help as much as they need it in the city schools.
Nancy.
And then the mayor wants to take over and run the school budget from City Hall, which is the absolute worst thing
Well,
to be
tell
done.
us why. Why do you think that's the worst thing?
The reason why it's the worst thing is, first of all, the people at City Hall are not educators and do not know the priorities. But beyond that, if it's done in a unilateral fashion at City Hall, they can appoint people, they can cut programs, they can add programs without regard to real need, but in response to political need. Comparing the performance in reading and math of the top 20% of the schools in the city and the bottom 20%, looking at some 50 or so variables.
Right.
And what we found is that the variable that accounts for 68% of the difference is the number of low-income pupils in the school.
Right.
And that relates to the fact that the schools are older, that they're less well taken care of, that they have more inexperienced teachers, they have more substitutes, that they have poorer books, and so on. That clearly indicates that something is wrong. Poor kids can learn just like rich kids. Poor kids need an opportunity. If you don't provide that opportunity by having a good, clean, safe building, having well-prepared teachers, having adequate budget, having adequate books, they will fall behind because they're climbing a steeper mountain. We need to enter the information age. The number of computers in our schools, except where you have very aggressive administrators who are able to get IBM and Apple to give them computers, is a shame. We just are not in the information age.
One, actually, the computer issue came up in some of our data that we
Some of our
submitted.
data was showing the major disparities between these districts in computer technology and the ability to have these resources there for the students, definitely. And that information was given to the Court of Appeals in the case as well.
And also, of course, we see traditionally, you look at library services in these schools virtually disappearing in the poorest neighborhoods.
See, the suggestion is that all this can be done by volunteers. This really is ludicrous. First of all, many of the people in poor neighborhoods, even though they may want to volunteer, do not have the technical skills all the time because they are raising their families, etc. So what we need to do is to increase the awareness of the rest of society of this inequity, because eventually it is in everyone's interest to have a high-quality education. You shouldn't have to go through 56 high school graduates to select someone to work at New York Tel or 9X or whatever. You need to have this education system beginning at preschool to work up so that you don't have to have these crash programs in the 11th and 12th grade or in the community colleges to try to get people ready.
For generations, public education has been the doorway to a better life in our society. That door has been shut in poor neighborhoods. While students in rich districts enjoy computers, state-of-the-art science laboratories, and well-stocked libraries, those in nearby but poor districts have to struggle with outdated books and crumbling facilities. Is this fair? Is this just? Is this American?
Well, this under the rubric of this reinventing government in New York City, while a lot of talk has gone on and people have seen the changes in the types of services that folks are getting, especially poor folks, the other thing that's happening is a restructuring, a reinventing of the racial ethnic composition of the workforce. And we're finding now a disproportionate number of blacks and Latinos who were more recent hirees of the city, basically losing their jobs or basically understanding that, listen, I better take the severance thing because otherwise I'm going to get laid off. We also find, tools like affirmative action tools, whether regulations or laws, being very ineffectual these days in terms of being weapons that we could use. Politically, we were able, even under the Koch administration, to make some gains. I mean, politically, it was a whole different approach to looking at these, black and Latino constituencies, and there was an attempt to bring in people for cynical reasons into city government, but you had the final effect was that you had more and more of our folks in there. Now you have a very different political situation where you have almost like a white backlash, and you have basically, again, that reconfiguration of government, making it smaller, getting out certain elements that are, not on board with the program. And that's something that we need to be monitoring very carefully. Issues like the Voting Rights Act, and what role does the Voting Rights Act play in all this at the national level and locally. And it'll be interesting to see again how the Democratic Party will be looking at issues like that. In other words, is it true that the Voting Rights Act has created all these safe seats for minorities, that has created an opening for Republicans to come and really challenge, white incumbents? That's going to be part of a debate. And again, I don't know how the Democratic Party is going to deal with that kind of issue.
With the California vote, obviously, on restriction of access to undocumented aliens to certain basic services, a lot of us here in the not-for-profit community feel that that's going to be repeated here in New York State as the next target of opportunity for that.
I think New York's very different. I mean, first of all, you don't have the kind of direct democracy, that you have in California, so it's very hard to pass stuff like this. In New York, it's usually English. We have the same experience with English only. By the time that stuff gets to the state legislature and gets back to referendum, half the people are dead who came up with the idea. But the other thing is that the mix here is very different. I think also the Latino population, over 80% of the Latino voters are Puerto Rican. We're U.S. citizens.
The contract with America is almost certain to be a bad bargain for all Americans living in large cities. Increasing numbers of people in visible and desperate poverty, and an overall deterioration in housing, public education, and health services won't stop with the very poor alone. All people of modest means will see a dramatic decline in their quality of life. The very rich will be able to run, perhaps. The millions of working people who have invested their lives in the cities that made America great will only be able to sue the politicians for a breach of contract at the ballot box and suffer through another bleak time for this nation. Before I sign off, those of you who wish to learn more about issues covered by the Urban Agenda, Cablevision, and newspaper columns may call or write the Community Service Society of New York for a free copy of the collected Urban Agenda articles. The number is 212-254-8900. This is David R. Jones. Thank you for joining us.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.